question and answer, and then there'll be a summation at the end where they make the points that they wish to emphasise most. I'm going to hand over now then to, you flip your coin, and Lad's going to speak first, so I'll hand over to Lad, and let's take 15 minutes each, then we'll...
Good morning, everybody. How you guys doing today? Yeah. How many days in the U.S. now? Have you been? About 4 days? And you got to the Hill yesterday, got to sit in a couple of hearings, I hear. Anyone fall asleep? It's okay, you can admit it if you did. No, but it sounds like you're having a good trip so far. It's always good to talk to this group. I'm glad you guys get a chance to come to the U.S. and kind of see how politics works here. You've probably picked up already that's a little bit different than it works in the UK. You might have picked up a little bit of different rhetoric, a little bit of different political strains, how partisanship might work here. So it's fascinating to me to kind of compare and contrast between the two countries. When we talk about gun violence, the experience with the United States and the UK is dramatically different. And I gave you guys a handout where at the bottom of the handout you kind of see some of the figures, and then I also put Canada, our neighbor to the north, as kind of a middle ground, kind of standard of comparison. The gun death rate here in the U.S. is more than 30 times as high as it is in your country. When I say gun death, I'm talking about gun deaths from all causes. That includes gun homicides, gun suicides, and then also accidental deaths by firearm. Again, our gun death rate is more than 30 times as high as yours is. Our gun homicide rate, people killing each other with guns, is more than 30 times as high as yours is. And then the overall homicide rate in our country, from all causes, guns, knives, beating people, whatever it is more than 3 times as high as your country. So a level of violence, particularly of gun violence in this country, that you simply don't see in the UK. Our argument at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence has never been that guns cause crime. Guns do not cause crime. But statistically what we know is that guns, access to guns, and particularly in this country, easy access to guns, makes attempted crimes more lethal, and it makes attempted suicides more lethal. To use the example of suicides very quickly, studies have shown that when someone attempts to take their life via cutting or overdose, typically those suicides are fatal 3 to 5% of the time. A suicide attempt by firearm is fatal 90% or more of the time. So it's not that guns tell people kill someone or kill yourself or whatever, it's that they make it a hell of a lot easier to do so. And that's really where we're coming from on the issue. Why is there such a dramatic difference in the gun death rate between your society and our society? Well, it's very simple. Your society has actually taken steps to protect public safety and ensure that if someone does get a firearm, that person is indeed law-abiding and not a threat to public safety. All the types of laws that you have in the UK that you probably take for granted, things like when you buy a firearm, you need to get a license, right? When you buy a firearm, you need to register that firearm with the government. Steps that the government takes to ensure that there is accountability when you own a firearm. These are things that we do not have at the federal level in this country, and in many states, only approximately a handful of even states out of the 50 states in the U.S. have any type of licensing and registration systems, and typically that's just for handgun owners. It wouldn't be for long gun owners. Also in your country, one thing that you probably take for granted is that when someone buys a gun, they undergo some type of background check, and if there's a licensing process, typically that's not just an instant computer check, checking computer databases, but under a licensing system that would also involve some type of background investigation. It might be providing a reference or two to testify that you're of good character. They might, I don't know exactly how it works in Britain, but it might be, providing a doctor's note to attest that you're of sound mental health. There's probably some type of training process there, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a process that involves more than a simple, few minutes through a computer, and if your record clears through the computer, you're fine and get the gun. In Britain, it's much more involved than that. In the United States, we have kind of a two-tier system of gun purchases, both of which are weaker than what you have in Britain. If you buy a gun in this country through a federally licensed dealer, and we have this two-tier system. Basically, the law in the United States says that if you are engaged in the business of dealing firearms, you have to conduct background checks on gun purchasers. Okay, so what does engaged in the business of dealing firearms mean? We're not exactly sure. The law has never really quantified that. There's no number of guns you'd be selling each year that would really tell the government whether you're engaged in the business. Typically, the government would only find out if you should be licensed but haven't gotten a license. In other words, you are indeed engaged in the business but don't have a license. They'd only find out if your guns end up on crime scenes, and they come back and later find, let's say, that you've been selling guns regularly at gun shows. So individuals who are not engaged in the business are what we call private sellers in this country. They're private individuals who basically sell guns, and they are not required to conduct background checks on purchasers, and they are not required to maintain any record of that sale. So there's no paperwork associated with that sale whatsoever. Where do these types of private sales take place in the U.S.? They take place at gun shows. They take place, they're advertised over the internet. People are selling guns over the internet through private sales. They're selling them through classified ads in newspapers. If we right now were in Virginia and we were both Virginia residents, I could sell you a AR-15 assault rifle on the corner for cash and carry. You would hand me the cash, I would give you the gun, you'd go home with it. I wouldn't know who the hell you are. I'm not conducting a background check on you, and law enforcement would have no paper trail whatsoever to follow in terms of knowing who sold that gun to who if that gun later ended up on a crime scene. So again, it's very nebulous in this country who's engaged in the business. The IRS, the government agency which oversees our tax our forms every year, they're not going through our tax forms and saying, well, this guy made $20,000 in income off gun sales this year, or this guy made that. There's no oversight. No one is looking at that. The only way that you would find out if someone's a private seller but really is constantly selling guns is if those guns end up on a crime scene. And then you investigate that and find out, damn, this guy's been at that gun show in Richmond every weekend, selling 10 to 20 guns. So again, this happens with semi-automatic handguns, semi-automatic assault rifles like AR-15s, AK-47s, any type. The types, and then that's a whole other aspect of this, is the types of guns that are legal on our market. You guys obviously have very strict restrictions on handguns. We have none of that. We freely allow people to purchase semi-automatic versions of battlefield weapons in this country. And again, I mentioned the AR-15, which is a semi-automatic version of the military's M16 rifle. The AK-47, the Soviet military rifle, you can buy a semi-automatic version of that through either a gun store or a private sale, no background check. So we've really created a system, sadly, in this country where there is almost no accountability. And if you are a felon, if you are a sex offender, if you are someone who beats his wife every week, you can easily, in 40 or more states, buy a gun through a private sale, no background check, and you also know there's not going to be any paper trail for law enforcement to follow to find out where that gun came from if it ends up on a crime scene. It would be very hard to connect that gun to you. To talk about some high-profile cases that you guys have undoubtedly heard of, are you guys familiar with the Tucson shooting that happened here last year? So, let's look at the Tucson shooting. The Tucson shooting is really a classic case of how insane gun laws have become in America. The kid that committed the Tucson shooting is a kid named Jared Loeffner. Utterly insane. Full-blown insane. And this isn't something which was a close call or, maybe this guy was a threat. This guy was just flat out crazy. You could tell by looking at his photo after the shootings that this guy was utterly demented. He had 2 prior drug-related arrests. He had tried to enter the military and was discharged because of psychiatric reasons. So that was another point. And he also, in the military, when he got in the military, failed a drug test when he tried to enter the military. I believe he had marijuana in his system at that point. So the military knew that he was a substance abuser, which is supposed to prohibit you when you buy a gun in this country, but there's no drug test when you buy a gun. So again, that's kind of an honor system type thing. And he was a guy that had a significant record of psychiatric illness. He had attended a community college for a while, and he was repeatedly disrupting his classes with aggression, violent outbursts. He was scaring the living hell out of his classmates and his teachers. it got so bad, and this was happening constantly in the library, in his classes. There was an email that came out afterward from one of his classmates, a woman that went to class with him, who said, you know, this is the kind of kid who's going to end up walking into a classroom with an automatic weapon and killing everyone. This was before the Tucson shootings. So it got so bad with his college that at one point they sent 4 campus security guards to his home residence with a letter, 4 guys to his home residence, just in case, I guess, right? To give him a letter telling him that if he could not produce a letter from a doctor testifying he was of sound mental health, that he was not welcome to ever come back to that campus again. They basically kicked him out of school because he was just getting so erratic and frightening. He bought 2 guns legally and passed background checks. Twice. Walked into the same store on 2 different occasions. One time he bought a shotgun, the other time he bought the semi-automatic handgun used in the shootings. I don't know if you saw the gun. We also allow people to have high-capacity ammunition magazines in this country. So it was a semi-automatic handgun with a magazine that stuck way the hell out of the gun that held 32 rounds. This kid had no military training. He had no police training. He had been to the range a couple of times with this weapon, a semi-automatic handgun with this 32-round magazine. This guy, in the space of about 15 seconds or so, was able to fire 30 or so rounds and hit 19 people. No military training, no police training. That's how lethal the weapons in this country have become that we're freely selling lunatics. Loeffner, under the laws of his state, this happened in Arizona. Arizona also allows people to now carry loaded handguns in public with no permit. Okay? Nothing. No screening, no permit, no training. So, and Loeffner that day took a cab down to the scene. So, even if someone had seen him acting erratic, or, you know, maybe had seen a flash of his gun that day as he made his way down to the supermarket to try to kill Gabby Giffords, the congressman from Arizona, police would not have been able to disarm him because there is no permit required to carry a gun in public in Arizona. In many states in this country now, you can openly carry a gun in public with no permit, no screening whatsoever. And in 4 states now, you are allowed to conceal a gun, and carry a loaded gun in public with no screening, no permit, nothing, no training, nothing. So Loeffner was perfectly safe right until the time that he opened fire in the parking lot of that supermarket. The Loeffner case is also a very interesting case because it impinges on some of the constitutional issues where our Constitution in this country has really been perverted as to what the original meaning of both the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was. Loeffner was a guy that bought into what we would call insurrectionist ideology. And this deals with how the NRA views the Second Amendment and how we view the Second Amendment. In his kind of political manifesto that Loeffner left, and he called this an assassination. He had a file at home about Congressman Giffords where he made it clear that he viewed this as an assassination. He was trying to kill her and assassinate her because he disagreed with her politically. This is what we call in the United States, unfortunately, Second Amendment remedies. And he wrote this political manifesto where he said, you don't have to accept the Federalist Laws. And this kind of cuts into this really old debate in this country that goes back to the ratification of the Constitution and the Federalists who Loeffner was referring to on one side, who drafted and ratified our Constitution because they believed that our country needed a more energetic, capable, and active federal government in order for our union to survive. Because at that point, the Articles of Confederation, which was our previous governing document, was just a mess. And our country was suffering economically. There was instability internally. We were having armed mobs that were rebelling and shutting down courts, like with Shays' Rebellion. There was a whole host of problems. The Federalists drafted and ratified the Constitution because they believed that only a more energetic, capable national government could remedy that situation and preserve our union, and they turned out to be right. But on the opposite side of that debate, even at that time, were anti-federalists who believed that you know, a energetic, capable national government and the potential for a standing army was a humongous threat to our nation. We've now got somehow, but the takeaway from that is that the Federalists won that debate. They were able to draft and ratify our Constitution, and that remains our governing document today. The Bill of Rights was written by James Madison, a Federalist, to satiate some anti-Federalist concerns and make sure that certain individual rights were guaranteed. And you guys are probably familiar with the text of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So what exactly did Madison mean by that? Well, at that time, if you go back to 1791, a long, long time ago when the Second Amendment was ratified, well-regulated state militias were indeed utterly invaluable and necessary to American life. We didn't have organized police forces back then. The state militia fought in our wars. They fought in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, et cetera, et cetera. So they were critical units for both fighting foreign wars, for protecting internal security. They fought against Native Americans in those battles. You name it, and they conducted certain internal security procedures like our modern-day police would now handle. And they were indeed well regulated. Back then, if you were serving in a state militia, it was a serious responsibility. You were required to maintain a firearm. You were required to come out, drill, train, and muster with those units. If you did not, there were punishments that could be applied for that. This was not just grab your gun, run around, and shoot a government official if you think he's gotten out of control. This was for government. These were units that, as Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, were organized and conducted by state governments. And the Second Amendment surely did seek to provide some buttress against potential federal tyranny, but it did so in the form of state militia. The idea of the Second Amendment was certain powers had been granted in the Constitution prior to the Bill of Rights that gave the federal Congress the right to organize, train, and equip the militia. And the Second Amendment was this attempt by Madison really to balance that, because the states got a little freaked out by that. They said, you know, if the federal government is able to organize, train, and equip us, what's to stop them from simply saying they're not going to do that and basically disbanding these units? So the Second Amendment guaranteed that basically individual firearms would be supplied within the state militia, and that the federal government would not be able to disarm them. So there was that notion there, certainly, but it was always under the conduct and authority and organization of state governments. It was not individuals like we had with Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion, which occurred years later, where individuals decided to take up firearms on their own and try to shut down local courts or overturn certain federal laws they disagreed with. This was indeed well regulated and organized, and there are certain, you know, the type of regulation we had at that point is something that the NRA would now fight tooth and nail today. The state at that point knew who owned firearms. They had lists of people serving in the militia. They essentially had a licensing and registration system, and that is something that would be anathema to the gun lobby today. So kind of the original meaning of that has been dramatically perverted. And it's reached a point now where the NRA and other groups within the gun lobby are arguing what we call this insurrectionist idea that individuals, totally outside the authority of state governments, have the right to basically keep and bear arms for the purpose of confronting our government with force, with violence, if they sense tyranny, if individuals sense tyranny, which was essentially what Timothy McVeigh did years ago. I don't know if you guys heard of that incident where there was a bombing in Oklahoma City. A radical guy basically blew up a building and killed 168 people. That's basically what McVeigh believed. He believed he had an individual right under the Second Amendment to take that action because he believed there was tyranny. This radical lunatic believed there was tyranny. Loeffner believed there was tyranny when he shot Gabby Giffords. You don't have to accept the Federalist Laws, he wrote. Well, you do have to accept the Federalist Laws. And if you want to change the Federalist Laws in this country in terms of the way our Constitution was written, you have to go through the peaceful means of redress of grievances that Madison and others laid out in our Constitution. You go through the courts. You petition your elected officials. There are a number of different means for you to peacefully resolve your grievances in this country without taking a gun and shooting an elected official, or shooting a law enforcement officer, or shooting a government agent. But again, we've reached a point in this country where politics on the gun issue have become so radicalized that this idea is now really, within GOP circles, within our Republican Party, has really sadly become an accepted idea. Because the gun lobby, I think, has been successful, sadly, in pushing it very aggressively. But the notion that Madison, a Federalist, would have embraced this idea that an individual like Shays rebels could basically take up a gun and shoot someone if they disagreed with their politics or a bill they had passed, it's obscene. It's obscene. And unfortunately, this idea that the federal government is an enemy, there was just a debate in Iowa last night on the gun issue where some guy got up and he was referring, you guys heard about this school shooting we had in Ohio the other night? Well, some Ohio delegate got up on their floor in their house the other night, and he was saying, you know, you shouldn't be worried about weak gun laws and what happened in Ohio. You should be protecting your children from the federal government. Referring, what? How so? A kid just got a gun from a household full of violent adults. This guy's dad, the kid's dad, who committed the shooting in Ohio, had a lengthy criminal record. This guy had beaten women his entire life. He'd attacked a police officer. This family had a history of violence you can't even imagine, and yet the houses this kid lived in were full of guns. From early reports, we're hearing 24 or more guns were available at this kid's disposal to basically grab and commit this crime with. Ohio has no law holding adults accountable, criminally accountable, when kids gain unauthorized access to their firearms. So if he did indeed steal that gun from his uncle's probably going to get off scot-free. There is a law in Ohio requiring the reporting of a lost and stolen gun, but the language is you must report it forthwith, which is kind of vague, and you know, maybe forthwith to some guy is within 3 months after he notices his gun is missing. He's probably the uncle's probably going to go scot-free on that one too. And a kid who was troubled and needed help and who had been surrounded by violence his entire life is probably going to be locked away for a long time. And the violent adults around him who armed him, who kept guns laying around for him, are probably going to go scot-free. And that's basically how the gun issue stacks up. And yet we should be scared, children should be scared of the federal government. Maybe perhaps the state government too, I don't even know. That's how insane and idiotic gun politics has gotten in this country, that people are actually saying this stuff. So, you know, the level of gun violence in this country is not a surprise. We allow people to buy guns with no accountability. We allow people to sell guns with no accountability. The next Jared Loughner, if you took a guy with the exact same mental health history, drug history of Jared Loughner, could still legally buy a gun in this country today. Nothing has been changed. The NRA has fought potential changes in Congress to the background check system that might have helped that. Nothing has changed. The next Jared Loughner could buy a gun today. The next demented kid like J.T. Lane in Ohio could probably still gain free access to any gun laying around a house there. And again, the adults would probably have zero accountability for that. So the gun violence in this country is not a surprise. People will be violent. Again, I'm not arguing that guns cause crime. I'm just arguing that in this country, we facilitate the access that people who are clearly dangerous. I'm not talking about someone who's it's a judgment call, where you look at their background and you say, well, they may or may not be dangerous. Jared Loughner wasn't a judgment call. He was clearly a threat. He was clearly deranged. He was clearly acting violently. Sung-Hee Cho, who shot up Virginia Tech, who also legally bought handguns, wasn't a judgment call. He had clearly been violent. He had a long history of mental illness and violent behavior. And I could go on and on. There's a zillion cases like this. We had a neo-Nazi in Pennsylvania who killed 3 cops, who had a concealed handgun permit in that state and walked around with a gun in public, who had written about Obama's gun ban and all this other conspiracy theory crap before he teed off on law enforcement officers. This guy was also legally selling guns for private sales and buying them that way. Who was he selling these guns to? We don't know. There's no paper trail associated with it. So when you have virtually no laws to protect the public, when you demonize the government as justification for that, and basically tell people that their government is the enemy, when in fact government has been restrained from doing anything to protect the public and make sure dangerous individuals don't get guns, you see the results that we have here in the U.S.